might finally be in sight. How has the pandemic shaped our world, and what would a new post-pandemic normal look like?
And what does the future hold for the world economy and globalization? What kind of lessons have we learned? Well, today we have invited special guests to join us on this forum, Our World Post-Pandemic. And joining us here in the studio
online today are Swaran Sen, professor at the University of British Columbia and a veteran Indian expert currently in Vancouver, Canada.
Also for the world, but there's certain optimism there. Professor Singh, do you share the same kind of concerns or optimisms? I mean, how can China's reopening contribute to global recovery?
China definitely, is world's largest trading nation. So whatever happens in China in terms of opening or closing of borders would not just have impact on Chinese economy, but I assume on rest of the world economy as well. So that has tremendous significance in that sense. But it's a difficult choice to make for any country. Life is important. So I understand that for a short term, the policy of total lockdowns can be understood, but it impacts on the livelihood if you save lives. And then, of course, beyond a point, one has to begin to take a call on whether countries should open up, and that's what China has done now in that sense. So it's a very delicate balance between life and livelihood in that sense for China, and likewise, it has an impact on rest of the world. I think what the lessons that world is learning now in terms of how to ensure that this kind of hit does not happen next time is to recalibrate, reorganize the supply lines, production lines, value lines, to avoid too much dependence on one region, one country, or one part of the world. Because if that part of the world gets impacted, then of course, the supply lines come into complete disruption. So that is another kind of a debate which would lead to some kind of recalibrating of global supply chains, etc. But when it comes to China, I think the China has shown that, for example, we faced similar difficulties in global slowdown in 2008 as well. And then there was talk of how the global economy is rebound from there. China has showcased that it has capacity to sort of recover from difficulties by state intervention, and primarily focusing on domestic infrastructure, domestic market, domestic consumption production itself can help it kind of grow. But my fear and concern, as Einar mentioned, from the global slowdown impacting United States into slowing down its economy, and Rajiv also mentioned the same thing. What we are noticing here is that in the context of Ukraine war continuing, there is going to be then perhaps focus on looking at weapons exports. Only recently United States for this year has cleared $858 billion of defense budget. But you have seen that repeatedly, one after another, to Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, to Pakistan, to Taiwan, Biden administration has been allowing some kind of packages of arms exports. So military-industrial complex would become a kind of a focus area in that sense to rebound exports of United States, and that may not be a good sign. The latest is Japan is trying to buy Tomahawks, and I think for this year's proposed budget, they have already assigned $1.58 billion to buy Tomahawks, which is unprecedented. It's a counter-attack weapon. And I think, if you look at the two reports that Japan had in December, National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, they want to double their defense expenditure. So, defense exports, therefore, could be an area where United States will then begin to focus if it faces larger slowdown in economic growth rates. And that may not be a good sign. I think the focus has to be much more on development rather than defense. And that kind of slowdown of economy in the United States could create trends which could be really counterproductive.
It's really difficult to predict. Entertain two ideas here. One, disrupted global supply chains can pretty much heal automatically. And when you lift restrictions on the flow of goods and people, therefore, we don't really need to do anything about it. Two, what we've seen in the last 3 years has only proven that those supply chains are really very fragile and susceptible to disruptions. Therefore, we need to strengthen the resilience of those supply chains. Are we even able to do that? Who should take charge
argument that market should be allowed certain freedom to rectify or deal with the challenges that are emerging occasionally, and this time from the pandemic. But I can understand that state need not intervene in micromanaging day-to-day issues, but state strategic direction would definitely be required. We have been talking of creating tax havens, tax holidays, subsidies, technology transfers. That kind of intervention, for example, challenges that flow from tariff wars with the United States. Market cannot handle that. It will need state intervention. Now, when it comes to supply chains fragility, I think this is primarily because globalization that we saw in last 20, 30 years had focused on pure economic logic of looking at the cheapest sort of location for cheap labor to produce for greater profits. Now, that kind of model will have to be redesigned. And I'm not talking of decoupling here, I'm talking of diversification of supply chains and production chains in that sense of creating multiple suppliers in multiple regions so that in situations like the pandemic, the supply lines do not completely come to a halt. Second, I think the production lines will also have to increasingly become automated. So automation would be another major area we will notice post-pandemic globalization will see, which would mean that some of the developing or rapidly developing countries which are focused on cheap labor will have to upskill their sort of workforce in that sense of providing them with the special skills to become really far more relevant in increasing automation of production. And third, very quick point is how the post-pandemic globalization perhaps would focus much more connectivity in terms of digital globalization, in terms of services sectors emerging as much important components of total globalization trends rather than production lines. So some kind of resetting, redesigning of globalization, I think we will see in coming years. And I think worst of the pandemic is more or less over, but it will not go very quickly. I think we will see several hiccups continuing in coming months and years in several separate regions, in separate variants. And so globalization will come back over a period of time with all the hiccups, disjunctions, but globalization is there to stay, except that this will be redefined and each of our countries, that is where state intervention again would be required, will have to prepare their populations to both deal with the redesigning of their consumptions, but also redesigning of their production. And in that sense, state intervention, I think, will be really critical in designing the post-pandemic globalization.
Professor